May 1941, the Battle of Crete. German paratroopers, the Fallschirmjäger, were falling from the skies in waves, blotting out the morning sun. While the world watched the airborne invasion unfold, a quiet, unmarked motor launch slipped across the Aegean Sea under the cover of darkness. On board were a dozen men of the British Special Boat Section, a secret unit barely known even within their own military. Their mission was simple on paper: disrupt German logistics, assist local resistance, and gather intelligence for the coming Allied counterattack. But nothing about Crete was simple. The men came from disparate corners of the empire: Royal Marines, commandos, and sailors with demolitions training. Their leader, Captain David Stirling's contemporary and fellow innovator, Captain Michael Mick Webb, carried a small notebook with just 3 words written on the inside cover: speed, silence, survival. Their insertion point was near Sphakia, on Crete's southern coast, a rugged shoreline of black cliffs and hidden coves. They were armed lightly: Lee-Enfield rifles, Sten submachine guns, plastic explosives, and 2 radios wrapped in oilskin. As they disembarked, the night was eerily still. Above them, faint red glows marked the burning airfields around Malim and Heraklion. Their orders were to move inland, link up with local partisans, and strike German convoys once the paratroopers began consolidating control. But Crete was already a battlefield. Roads were cut, villages burned, and Allied troops were retreating toward evacuation beaches. The commandos were stepping into a war that was collapsing around them. By the 3rd night, Webb's team reached the foothills of the White Mountains. They carried little food, relying on Cretan shepherds who risked their lives to feed them. "No one trusted anyone," wrote one of the men later in a fragmentary journal found after the war. Even the wind seemed to carry German ears. They learned quickly that the Luftwaffe patrolled daily, strafing anything that moved on open ground. The mountains offered cover, but also isolation. Then came the first blow. Their main radio set, a Mark III transmitter, was damaged during a hurried relocation under air attack. That meant no contact with Cairo, no confirmation that London even knew they were still alive. The men pressed on regardless. By early June, they had struck their first target, a fuel dump near Rethymno, which they set ablaze with silent efficiency. Eyewitnesses from nearby villages later recalled the fire lighting the horizon like a second sunrise. The Germans combed the hills for the saboteurs, but the SBS were already gone, vanishing into the labyrinthine gorges. The mission was working, at least on the ground. Each raid delayed supplies, sowed confusion, and bolstered Cretan resistance. Yet with no contact home, Webb began to worry. The island was now fully in German hands, and the last Allied ships had left weeks ago. The raiders were stranded behind enemy lines, with dwindling ammunition and no clear exfiltration route. Their rations were so low that the men resorted to foraging wild herbs and goat's milk. Despite exhaustion, morale remained unbroken. As one commando supposedly told a local priest, "We fight so that someone somewhere will know we did not give up." The British knew little of what their commandos were enduring. London's intelligence files mentioned the unit only briefly: SBS detachment, last seen May 1941, Crete operation ongoing. Then nothing. No further transmissions, no reports, no survivors ever recorded returning to Cairo. It was as if the island had swallowed them whole. The strategic lesson of Crete, often quoted by historians, came from General Bernard Freyberg, who commanded the Allied defense. Those who control the sea and the air control the island. Those who control the mountains control its heart. Webb and his men had chosen the heart and paid the price for it. Today, military analysts might call it an early example of asymmetric warfare, small units leveraging local terrain and resistance support to strike larger, mechanized forces. But to the men themselves, it was simply endurance. They were cut off, hunted, and increasingly invisible to both friend and foe. Their only trace months later would be discovered by a German patrol, a hidden cache of British explosives, empty ration tins, and a torn page from a field notebook bearing one haunting line: "Hold position until word comes." No word ever did. As the summer of 1941 deepened, German patrols continued to search the southern mountains, while local villagers whispered of foreign fighters who appeared at night, then melted back into the rocks. Whether Webb's team perished, escaped, or went underground with the resistance remains uncertain. But by the time Allied intelligence revisited Crete 2 years later, no official record of their fate existed. And so the story of the vanishing British raiders began, with a handful of men, a broken radio, and an island that would remember them long after history forgot. The next chapter would reveal how their unseen war continued, through whispers, sabotage, and the haunting question of whether they ever truly disappeared. By autumn of 1941, the war in Crete had taken on a strange rhythm, part occupation, part resistance, part ghost story. German troops controlled the main towns and airfields, yet every few weeks, something inexplicable happened. Fuel depots erupted in flames. Ammunition convoys were found wrecked in mountain passes, their guards missing. To the local villagers, these were acts of divine retribution. To German command, they were the work of English raiders, men no one could find or confirm existed. The British archives later confirmed that small-scale sabotage was continuing long after official contact with the island had ceased. The question was, by whom? The last recorded transmission from Captain Webb's SBS detachment had been on May 31, 1941, the night before the final Allied evacuations from Sfakia. After that, silence. Yet eyewitness accounts from Crete painted a different story. Farmers near the village of Anogia recalled helping tall, quiet men who carried no insignia but spoke English and offered gold sovereigns for food. According to one elderly partisan, interviewed decades later, these soldiers worked like shadows. They struck at night, targeting German motor columns between Heraklion and Rethymno. In one such attack, an entire fuel convoy exploded in the narrow gorge of Patsos, a fire so intense it burned for 2 days. The Germans sealed off nearby villages and shot dozens of civilians in reprisal, but no trace of the saboteurs was ever found. Coded messages began surfacing among the resistance, short notes written in English and left at drop points, target next week. Be ready. No one knew who wrote them. Some suspected a remnant of British officers who had refused evacuation. Others believed it was a coordinated deception run from Cairo. Yet when British intelligence reviewed resistance intercepts years later, the code formats matched those of the missing SBS detachment. In late 1941, the German commander on Crete, General Alexander Andre, issued a furious report to Berlin. Enemy elements persist on the island despite complete occupation. Locals refuse cooperation. Unknown force responsible for repeated acts of sabotage. The report noted unusual precision. Attacks occurred only on high-value supply routes or near key depots. Whoever was behind them knew German logistics intimately. The islanders called them Ta Phantasmata, the phantoms. To them, these men were both protectors and omens. A young Cretan woman, Maria Sifikis, later recounted how a wounded Briton appeared at her family's farm one winter night. He said nothing, just smiled, drank a little water, and left his pistol behind. We found his tracks leading into the snow above the ravine. After that, no more bombs fell on our valley. Her story would be repeated, with variations, across the island. From a military perspective, continued raids were improbable. Without supply drops or communication, an isolated unit could not survive for months, let alone years. Yet similar incidents were reported into 1942. British historian Anthony Beevor once wrote, "Crete became a living ghost of the Mediterranean War, a place where the impossible occasionally seemed true." Modern historians believe Webb's surviving men may have split into smaller cells, integrating with local resistance groups like EOK and ELAS. Their expertise in demolition and reconnaissance could explain the sudden sophistication of partisan operations during this period. One declassified SOE memo from Cairo even hinted that resistance methods on Crete suggest prior commando influence. Still, the paper trail ends abruptly. No names, no captures, no confirmed deaths. Even post-war German reports list British saboteurs unknown among unsolved cases. What remains are fragments, burnout trucks, coded notes, and the faint outline of a campaign waged by men who should not have been there. The surviving villagers remember them not as soldiers, but as figures who came and went with the wind, sometimes to fight, sometimes to warn. A diary fragment attributed to an anonymous SBS survivor and later found in a cave near Kallikrates reads, "We no longer wait for orders. The island itself commands us now." That line, simple, fatalistic, captures the truth of what Crete became. Cut off from the world, the surviving commandos transformed from soldiers into ghosts of their own mission. They no longer fought for command, they fought for meaning. As 1942 dawned, German high command tightened its grip. Villages suspected of aiding saboteurs were burned to the ground. Still, the attacks continued. And among the ruins, German soldiers began to whisper, "The English are still here." In the next chapter, intercepted German messages would finally provide the first concrete clue, evidence that the missing raiders were not only alive but still fighting a war that no one had ordered. By early 1942, the mystery of the missing British raiders on Crete had deepened into legend. Allied intelligence intercepted fragmented German radio transmissions describing repeated night attacks on convoys and supply depots, attacks carried out by English ghosts who vanished before anyone could identify them. The messages, cryptic and often contradictory, suggested a highly mobile, elusive force that seemed almost impossible to track. For British intelligence officers reviewing the intercepts in Cairo, it was both tantalizing and maddening. Their own men might still be alive, yet there was no way to confirm their fate. The White Mountains and surrounding gorges had become the theater of a shadow war. The terrain itself was a formidable ally. Sheer cliffs, hidden caves, and labyrinthine ravines made movement almost undetectable. Villagers who aided the raiders risked summary execution by German forces. One Cretan partisan, Nico Saros, later recalled the tension of guiding unknown British soldiers along narrow trails. We never saw their faces clearly. At night, they were shadows, moving faster than fear itself. German patrols reported repeated ambushes on motor convoys traveling between Chania and Rethymno. In one notable attack in March 1942, an entire column of trucks carrying fuel and ammunition was destroyed near the village of Rices, leaving nothing but twisted metal and scorched earth. Eyewitnesses reported seeing tall men in English uniforms, firing and disappearing into the hills. Yet no bodies were recovered, and no official Allied reports corroborated the incident. It was as if the raiders operated outside time and record. Historical evidence suggests these operations may have been carried out by surviving members of Webb's SBS unit who split into smaller cells. Operating independently, they coordinated with local resistance networks such as ELAS and EAM. A decrypted German report from April 1942 notes, "Enemy elements have adopted guerrilla tactics. Their knowledge of terrain and supply routes suggests prior military training beyond that of local partisans. This strongly implies that the raiders were still active, striking opportunistically while evading capture." Diary fragments discovered decades later give further insight into their mindset. One passage reads, "We move like shadows, strike like lightning. Each day we survive is another day the enemy loses sleep." The raiders' objective was no longer solely sabotage. It was psychological warfare. By appearing unexpectedly, attacking efficiently, and disappearing without trace, they undermined German morale and forced the occupiers to divert resources to patrol mountain passes instead of frontline operations. Despite their effectiveness, the human cost was severe. Isolated, constantly on the move, and operating without resupply, the men faced hunger, illness, and exhaustion. They relied entirely on the courage of local villagers, who provided shelter and sustenance at great personal risk. In one recorded incident, a British soldier fell gravely ill with dysentery. A Cretan family hid him for 2 weeks in a cave before he could rejoin his unit. Every day was a fight against nature, the enemy, and the limits of endurance. The lessons of this chapter resonate beyond historical curiosity. The raiders demonstrated the power of mobility, local intelligence, and small unit initiative, principles that modern special forces still study. As military historian Anthony Beaver observed, Crete became a laboratory of guerrilla warfare. What was improvised, secret, and isolated had consequences far beyond the island itself. Yet the ultimate question remained unresolved. Did any of these men survive beyond 1942? By the summer of that year, all direct contact with Allied command had ceased. Reports from the island were anecdotal, often conflicting, and never fully verified. The missing raiders had become not only a tactical problem for the Germans but a historical enigma, a story of men who existed in whispers, notes, and burned wreckage. As the year progressed, German commanders grew increasingly frustrated. Every time they thought the raiders were gone, new sabotage attacks would appear, strategically timed, expertly executed, and always vanishing before reinforcements could respond. The island itself seemed complicit, concealing the British men in its mountains and gullies. The next chapter will reveal the first tangible evidence of their continued existence, buried caches, hidden weapons, and the daring reconnaissance missions that hinted the raiders had survived longer than anyone dared to imagine. By 1943, Crete had become a dangerous chessboard of occupation, resistance, and hidden warfare. The German presence was stronger than ever, with fortified towns and airfields under constant surveillance. Yet scattered reports of unexplained explosions, burned convoys, and missing soldiers persisted. Allied Command, desperate to understand these anomalies, launched reconnaissance missions into the mountainous interior, hoping to uncover evidence of the elusive British raiders who had disappeared nearly 2 years earlier. One such mission in late spring was led by a small contingent of Royal Engineers and WWII officers tasked with mapping and assessing suspected resistance strongholds. Their goal was to locate caches of weapons, ammunition, or intelligence left by British operatives. In the remote Amari Valley, they discovered something remarkable: a series of recently disturbed earth, carefully concealed caches of Sten guns, grenades, and plastic explosives, all bearing British markings. The items were not abandoned long ago. Some had been placed within the past few months, suggesting the raiders, or someone using their methods, were still operating. The discovery raised both hope and unease. Allied officers began piecing together the possibility that a remnant of Webb's team had survived the initial German occupation and continued guerrilla operations independently. Cretan villagers corroborated this theory. They spoke of men in green coats who appeared suddenly, carried out missions, and vanished without a trace. One elder, Georgios Papadakis, later recounted, "They fought like lions, but we never knew who they were. They spoke little, and only at night." A particularly significant find was a partially preserved diary hidden inside a hollow tree near a mountain cave. Its entries were cryptic, references to sabotaging fuel supplies, intercepting German communications, and evading capture. One line stood out: "We are not here for glory, only to ensure tomorrow's freedom." These words offered insight into the mindset of men cut off from official command yet still driven by duty and survival. From a military perspective, the cache discovery demonstrated the strategic value of small, autonomous units working with local allies. Even without direct orders or resupply, these raiders could disrupt enemy logistics and morale. Modern historians note that such operations foreshadowed later SAS and WWII methods in occupied Europe. The raiders' ability to survive behind enemy lines while maintaining operational impact remains a case study in resilience, improvisation, and guerrilla warfare. Yet with every revelation, the mystery deepened. No names, no photos, no captured personnel, only evidence of skillful, calculated operations. The British War Office, reviewing the findings, recorded in a memo elements of SBS active beyond all anticipated timelines, personnel unknown, operationally inconclusive. It was as if the island itself had absorbed these men, leaving only traces of their presence. For the men themselves, life in the mountains had become a delicate balance of survival and mission execution. They moved constantly, avoiding both German patrols and curiosity from villagers. Illness, fatigue, and injury were constant companions, yet their discipline remained unbroken. One raider reportedly wrote in a smudged note, "If we fall, let the mountains remember us. If we live, let the enemy fear us." By the end of 1943, German forces had intensified patrols, yet the raiders continued to operate. Each mission they carried out sowed confusion, delayed supply lines, and reinforced the myth of the English ghosts haunting Crete. For historians and military analysts alike, these operations illustrate a profound lesson. Small, determined units leveraging local knowledge and initiative can have a disproportionate impact, even when cut off from command. The chapter closes on a note of suspense. While Allied reconnaissance uncovered traces of the raiders' continued existence, no one could say where they were headed, how many remained alive, or whether they would ever leave the island. The stage was set for an even more intriguing revelation. Decades later, local testimonies would hint that some British soldiers had lived openly among Cretan partisans, blending into the resistance while remaining officially unrecorded. After the war, Crete slowly returned to a fragile peace, but the legend of the vanished British raiders refused to fade. Villagers who had witnessed the nighttime operations began speaking more openly, recounting encounters with strangers who appeared, struck swiftly, and then disappeared without explanation. In several mountain villages, elderly partisans revealed that a few British soldiers had lived among them for years, adopting local clothing, speaking in broken Greek, and even participating in community work, all while secretly coordinating resistance operations. These revelations baffled historians. No official records matched the names or descriptions of these men. British military archives remained silent, listing only the SBS detachment's May 1941 deployment and a note: "No confirmed survivors. Operation incomplete." Yet the villagers' memories were detailed. One woman, Eleni Maroutis, recalled a man who would sit quietly by her hearth, listening to stories, and then vanish at dawn to sabotage German convoys. The lines between soldier, spy, and local resistance fighter had blurred entirely. Artifacts found years later, including caches of Sten guns and handwritten notes hidden in caves, confirmed part of these accounts. Some items bore British markings and operational codes identical to those used by the missing raiders. Combined with oral testimony, it became clear that these men had essentially erased themselves from official history, choosing survival and continued resistance over recognition or return. One partisan leader described them simply: they became part of the mountains. They were no longer soldiers, they were Crete. The human cost, however, was not small. Villagers who aided them faced reprisals from German forces, including executions and village burnings. Yet despite fear and loss, the collaboration endured. The raiders' dedication and discipline inspired local resistance units to continue operations long after the formal British presence had vanished. Strategically, it illustrated the effectiveness of deep integration between foreign operatives and indigenous fighters, a model later mirrored in other World War II theaters, such as Yugoslavia and Southeast Asia. For British military historians, this chapter of Crete remained both frustrating and fascinating. The raiders had achieved their objective: disruption, intelligence, and the empowerment of local fighters. Yet their complete disappearance from official records left the story incomplete, unresolved, and deeply mysterious. One post-war War Office report tersely noted, operationally inconclusive, personnel unaccounted for. Local testimonies indicate continued activity beyond expected timelines. The takeaway is profound. These men demonstrated the extraordinary impact of initiative, adaptability, and collaboration with locals, principles that remain central to modern special operations doctrine. Their story underscores that not all victories are recognized in reports or medals. Some exist only in the lasting impression left on allies, communities, and adversaries alike. By the late 1940s, the mystery of the missing British raiders had taken on near-mythical status. Villagers whispered of shadowy figures moving through the mountains even after the war had ended. Some claimed to see them briefly at night, carrying rifles or relaying messages, only to vanish before recognition. While the world moved on, the echoes of their actions lingered in the gorges and caves of Crete, setting the stage for the final haunting chapter, when decades later, a shepherd's discovery would hint at the raiders' ultimate fate, or at least their last known traces. In 1979, nearly 4 decades after the war, a Cretan shepherd named Nikos Demetriadis stumbled across a rusted metal object while tending his goats in a remote mountain pass near Anogeia. Upon closer inspection, it was a waterproof field radio, partially buried and corroded by time. Beside it lay a folded map marked with British grid codes and several small, rusted ammunition boxes. Experts later confirmed that these relics almost certainly belonged to the missing SBS detachment, the very men who had vanished in 1941, leaving only whispers and legends behind. The discovery reignited historical interest in the mysterious raiders. Military archaeologists and historians retraced possible routes and safe houses, piecing together fragments of an operation that had remained unresolved for decades. Local villagers confirmed stories of men who had lived among them, striking at German convoys and disappearing into the mountains. Their survival skills, knowledge of the terrain, and ability to evade both German patrols and Allied command had allowed them to operate effectively for months, if not years. Yet the records revealed little about their ultimate fate. No official accounts, no recovered bodies, no identification of the surviving members. Analysts speculate that the raiders' final transmissions may never have been sent. Perhaps they were killed in a skirmish, or perhaps they integrated permanently into resistance networks, fading into anonymity to protect the locals who had helped them. One diary fragment recovered near the site read, "If the world forgets us, let the mountains remember." In many ways, they had succeeded beyond expectation. Their sabotage delayed German supply lines, strengthened the local resistance, and became a case study in guerrilla warfare that is still taught in military academies today. The long-term significance of their actions is profound. These raiders operated without oversight, under extreme conditions, and with minimal support, yet their impact on the Cretan campaign was disproportionate. Their story illustrates the power of initiative, local collaboration, and adaptability, lessons that modern military strategists still apply to unconventional warfare. Moreover, it reminds us that history is often shaped by those whose contributions are unrecorded or erased, leaving only traces and testimony behind. Despite decades of research, the final mystery remains. Who exactly survived? How long did they continue operations? And did any ever return to Britain, unnoticed by official records? The radio, map, and scattered artifacts suggest survival, ingenuity, and secrecy, but no definitive answers. The vanished raiders of Crete became legends not because of heroic ceremonies, medals, or parades, but because of the invisible imprint they left on both the enemy and the island itself. Today, hikers and shepherds in the White Mountains occasionally report seeing strange movements at night, or remnants of old ammunition caches in caves. Scholars continue to debate whether these were echoes of the original SBS team or later resistance groups inspired by their methods. Either way, the story of the vanishing British raiders endures, a haunting testament to courage, secrecy, and the mysteries of war that refuse to be fully explained. The mountains of Crete still keep their secrets, and so do the men who once moved through them, leaving behind a trail of fire, courage, and enduring legend.